In 2025, a high-stakes geopolitical drama really pushed the Middle East to the absolute brink and, ended up reshaping the global order. This is the story of how a full year of really tense diplomacy just gave way to open conflict. So let's break down the US-Iran crisis.
So how did this all start? Well, it all kicked off with just a single letter. But this letter set a very, very dangerous clock ticking. The demand inside seemed simple enough, but the consequences of failure, they were nothing short of catastrophic.
You have to understand the backdrop here. Iran's nuclear program was advancing and fast. So fast, in fact, that the UN's nuclear watchdog was warning they could soon have enough material for multiple bombs. It's in this climate that the Trump administration decided to bring back its maximum pressure campaign. The whole idea was to force Iran back to the negotiating table.
And the ultimatum itself was, it was shockingly blunt. On March 7, 2025, the terms were laid out crystal clear. Get a nuclear deal done in 60 days, or you're going to face military action. This wasn't really a negotiation. It was a high-risk, high-stakes gambit designed to break the stalemate for good.
And right here, you see the core of the problem. The two sides were starting worlds apart. The US was demanding the complete and total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, Iran insisted its program was peaceful and that enriching uranium was its inalienable right. This fundamental clash, well, it would go on to define the entire crisis.
Now, you might think that's the end of the story, but despite all that harsh rhetoric, this ultimatum actually did trigger a frantic series of negotiations. With Oman playing the mediator, both sides started looking for a way out of the corner they'd been backed into.
So, the first round kicks off in Muscat. But this was an indirect negotiation, which is pretty interesting. The U.S. delegation, led by Steve Witkoff, and the Iranian team under Abbas Araghchi, they were in separate rooms. You had Omani mediators literally shuttling messages back and forth. And at first, both sides were actually calling the talks constructive. And this part is really crucial. Iran didn't just say no. They came to the table with a pretty detailed plan. This three-step proposal, it laid out a potential, though, incredibly complex, path to a deal. It started with de-escalation. This showed that, at least in the beginning, they were willing to engage.
So the diplomatic carousel keeps spinning, right? More talks pop up in Rome and then back in Muscat through April and May. The diplomats are working against the clock. But as these discussions are happening, events on the ground are taking a much, much more aggressive turn.
And this is really the paradox of the spring of 2025. Even while negotiations were happening, the U.S. was building up its military presence, new sanctions were being rolled out, even hitting Chinese companies, which pulled Beijing deeper into this whole mess. And both Iran and Israel were making direct military threats. The drums of war were just beating louder every single day. So by the time June rolls around, that 60-day deadline is expiring, and that fragile diplomatic process, it completely shatters. This leads to the first wave of military conflict, which would become known as the 12-Day War.
And really, this two-day sequence, this was the point of no return. On June 12th, the IAEA declares Iran non-compliant. Then, literally the very next day, with that ultimatum clock hitting zero, Israeli warplanes were in the air, striking targets all across Iran.
And these strikes from Israel, they were precise and they were devastating. They didn't just hit buildings. They were targeting the brain of Iran's nuclear and military apparatus. They took out top leaders and scientists, and they even injured the very man who was overseeing the negotiations for Iran.
It didn't stop there. 8 days later, the United States officially joined the fight. American bombs hit Iran's three most critical nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And with that, the talks were officially dead, suspended indefinitely.
After a tense ceasefire and after large-scale anti-government protests actually broke out inside Iran, the parties agreed to one last, desperate shot at diplomacy in early 2026. This was it. This was the final chance to avoid a full-blown regional war.
But the mood this time around was just incredibly pessimistic. This quote here from the U.S. Secretary of State, it perfectly captures the deep, deep mistrust that just plagued the talks from the second they restarted. There was really very little optimism on either side.
And then came another deadline. But this time, it wasn't 60 days, it was just 10. The message could not have been clearer. Make a deal right now, or you will face a war far, far larger than what you saw last June.
And in the end, after all that back and forth, all the strikes, all the talks, it all came back to this. The US demanded zero enrichment, period. The Iranians not only insisted on their right to enrich, but according to the US envoy Steve Witkoff, they actually boasted that they had enough material for 11 bombs. The gap was just unbridgeable.
So, the 10-day ultimatum expired. Diplomacy was officially dead. What followed was a massive, coordinated military operation. And the consequences? They were immediate, they were widespread, and they were catastrophic.
On February 28th, the war began. And make no mistake, this was not a limited strike. This was a full-scale assault aimed at decapitating the Iranian regime. They assassinated the supreme leader and killed top military commanders. Iran, of course, immediately retaliated, and the entire region was just engulfed in conflict.
The global reaction was swift, and it revealed some really deep fractures. Let's take China, for example, a key economic partner for Iran. As this analysis from the Atlantic Council noted, Beijing found itself in an impossible bind. They publicly condemned the attack, but they just lacked the military power to truly challenge the US and Israel in the region.
Then you have Russia, another one of Iran's so-called partners. Well, they were basically exposed as a paper tiger. For all their anti-Western talk, Moscow offered little more than condolences. It proved they either lacked the will or the capacity to really defend their ally when it counted.
So what about America's own allies, the European Union? They were completely fractured. This analysis really hits the nail on the head. They were caught between trying to defend a rules-based order and their traditional alignment with Washington. And the result? Paralysis. No unified European response.
Of course, the economic shockwave was immediate. The fighting threatened the world's most critical oil choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. And because of that, oil prices were projected to spike towards $100 a barrel, threatening to tip the entire global economy into recession.
And so all of this leaves us with this huge fundamental question. Was this tragic outcome the result of Iran simply choosing a self-destructive path, just miscalculating at every single turn? Or, when you really look at the irreconcilable positions and all the escalating pressures, was a devastating war in the Middle East simply inevitable?